This video is sponsored by Squarespace. If I told you that Hoodwinked earned around 14 times its budget at the box office, you'd probably just make a big schnitzel on a stick in your pants. But what makes this box office number even more impressive are the conditions that this film was made under. Because with a tiny budget of only $8 million, Hoodwinked was actually one of the very first independently funded, fully CGI movies. And with this amount of money on dodgy 2005 hardware, this project was so hard to pull together that even the film's director, Cory said that the chances of any of this working out was just absurdly low. And so that's why I sat down with Cory to discuss not only the literal oceans they had to cross to get this to work, but also why it looks the way it does, how people like Harvey Weinstein then got involved, and the effect that him coming in at the very last minute had on this film. Before then, also going on to discuss what to do if you want to see more Hoodwinked. Because right at the end of our talk, Cory let me in on a little secret that absolutely blew my mind. So to explore all of this and more, drink your coffee and start an avalanche as we dive into the creation of Hoodwinked. So now, considering this film was released only 10 years after the completely groundbreaking Toy Story, you'd think that an animated film like this would have been created with the backing of a major studio. But like we said, that isn't Hoodwinked's story, and instead this entire thing started with just Cory and his brother, Todd sat working away in an apartment in Pasadena, trying to desperately come up with the next big thing. And to explain it properly, I'll let Cory say this bit from when he explained it to me in our talk.
It's my brother and I were both working. We had a production company together and we were just working in like commercials and music videos and like just client work, whatever we could get. But our dream was to make movies. And my brother had already directed a film that went to Sundance, and that was a big boost for us. But we couldn't quite get the next thing going. And one of our investors on our Sundance film, he was just interested in the next project, and he'd only put, $5-6 grand into our independent film that we did. So we put a lot of scripts in front of this investor that we knew in San Francisco. And they were all live action, kind of indie, late 90s kind of indie style, crime thriller kind of comedies. But then we showed him, just as proof that we can finish things, we showed him a direct to video robot adventure I made with another small company here in the US called Wobots with a W. So we showed him this DVD. We said, look, we also did animation. And that's when we really got his attention.
Because their investor was looking to make something like a Disney film, where they take an old story that already had awareness, like Cinderella, and then kind of modernize that through animation. But of course, in 2005, most of those old fairy tales had already been done, and had been done so well that without retreading on the same ground, there weren't really too many stories left for Cory and Todd to explore. Well, that was until they began to consider the story of Little Red Riding Hood.
And then we said, well, Red Riding Hood is very universal. And as I researched, it's like there are cultures around the world that tell this story. And sometimes the wolf is a bear, and sometimes the wolf is a troll. But it is the cautionary tale of a girl in the woods trying to get to her grandmother. And it's like, okay, this is a universal story. This is one that might work, but it's like you can tell that story in 5 minutes.
And so this was the major problem with the Red Riding Hood story, that there wasn't really any more to it beyond what Cory had just described. However, at the same time, this lack of content also meant they had the freedom to expand upon that in any way they wanted.
So when my brother called me one day and said, hey, what if we did this like Pulp Fiction or Run Lola Run? What if we told the story of Red Riding Hood like a crime story, and the cops show up and they take statements and kind of like all in one moment spelled out, like, what if we tell the story 4 times from 4 points of view from the 4 characters? And I was like, I got excited. And I think that as a filmmaker, if it's a movie you want to see, that gives you the steam to make it through 3 years of hell. And so I was driven by that from that moment on, like, we got to make this. This is so awesome. If we come close to making a movie the way that is suddenly popping into my head, this will be great.
And so, all on their own, Cory, Todd, and their friend Tony Leach spent the next 2 to 3 months writing this story and looking for wiggle room where they could subvert each character's narrative in this non-linear way, before then also going on to prepare all of the other elements of the film as well, like its storyboards, its songs, and even all of its voices. But despite being a great idea, this is also where kind of all of the problems with this film really began to start. Because to be able to encapsulate things like this multi-narrative story, the project was just constantly slowly growing in things like scale and complexity. But because their investor, Maurice Camber, was paying for this film completely out of his own pocket, each time that it grew, he was getting less and less happy.
We were working on this for 3 years, on and on.
Okay.
And budget was slightly grow. Yeah. And our investor in San Francisco would get really cranky about that. Some of the producers would go up and talk to him, and I'd get on the phone and he'd be ready to cut the project and shut it down. And we'd be like, hang on, this is why it costs more now. We just found out that you've got to be at least 4K resolution to be on a big screen in a movie theater.
And so this financial back and forth went on for a really long while, and as it did so, day by day, Cory and his team felt like the film's chances of actually coming to fruition were just reducing rapidly, until eventually one guy got involved and suddenly things began to really pick up traction. But before we get to that, I wanted to introduce you to the sponsor of today's video, Squarespace, the all-in-one platform for entrepreneurs to stand out and succeed online. Because I've recently been using Squarespace to create my very own website, and through its cutting-edge design intelligence and blueprint AIs, I was able to get a good-looking website up and running within just a few minutes, basically. And what really blew me away about this was just how effortless and intuitive the whole thing felt. Because with their visual design tools, it took just a few simple tweaks afterwards, and I had the exact website I wanted, despite knowing literally nothing about web design. And furthermore, speaking of things that were easy to set up, by using Squarespace payments, I was also easily able to create payment methods like Apple Pay, Klarna, or Afterpay for any customers who visit the site. So whether you are just starting out or managing a growing brand, Squarespace makes it easy to create a beautiful website, engage with your audience, and sell anything all in one place. So head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/CGY to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain when you use the code CGY. And with that, now back to the video and back to the one guy whose involvement may have saved the entire Hoodwinked project.
We did get Patrick Warburton from the get-go. He was our first guy that ever signed on with no money, no contract. He just liked us.
How did you find him then? Did you just send the scripts to people?
Yeah, he was, again, it's like this weird path that doesn't make sense. Patrick does like big stuff, and then he does little stuff. He's just a really interesting guy as far as what he will and won't do. If it's interesting to him, he'll do it. So he was on an independent film that Tony Leach, one of our co-directors and co-writers, was on. And Tony just said, we're working on an animated movie. You're one of the best voices we could ever get. And he said, well, send me the script. You know, suddenly a couple weeks later, we're sitting in Jerry's Deli in LA, and in walks Patrick Warburton. And it's like meeting with a fictional character. It's crazy when you finally get to sit down with somebody you've heard most of your life.
Yeah, does he have the voice in real life? Does he sound like that?
Yeah, I really like the script. It's really funny. Yeah, I'll do it. And it's like he stepped out of the TV, and he has been our champion. I mean, if I call him tomorrow, he'll do something with me, because he just really enjoyed our independent spirit that you talk about.
And so, with a big name like Patrick Warburton attached, word of this little indie film with a great script began to spread across town. And therefore, with this, more and more people wanted to get involved. And therefore, finally, for Cory and his team, things were actually starting to look up, and Hoodwinked was finally starting to look like it had a future. But now, before we go any further, we probably should address the elephant in the room with this film. That, yeah, it's not the best looking film in the world, but there was actually a massive reason for this. Because whilst nowadays you can do a lot from your bedroom with just a laptop, you know, like watch some educational videos or create some high quality renders, when the animation on this film started back in around 2002-ish, literally only a few companies and a few people in the entire world had both the technology and the know-how to actually make an animated film like Toy Story. And so because of this, and because of its low budget, this film was actually animated out in the Philippines by a team of artists who were mostly all pretty much new to the CGI game, meaning that essentially they were on a minecart with the tracks blown off. Because now everyone involved, from the directors like Cory to the vast majority of their CGI team, had to learn how to pull an entire movie together essentially from scratch. And so because of reasons like this, it wasn't until they finally managed to get some of those very few people in the world with the knowledge of CGI filmmaking, like ex-Pixar and ex-DreamWorks members, who could come in and help, that things actually started going smoothly for them.
We ended up bringing in some ringers, some people who did have a lot of experience, but it was later in the game. Like even experience in arranging the pipeline. That's when I learned, man, you got to know that you have a good pipeline to move all of your data. You got your creative people, your technical people, and then it moves down this pipeline that you've got to know what you're lighting. And like we had people lighting this film where like 20 lights in one scene, and we're going to turn all the lights on. And then like we had a very experienced person come in and say, you need 3 lights in this scene.
And so, with people like this finally on board, and over the course of many years, thousands of hours from the animators, and many trips between the USA and the Philippines for Cory and the rest of his team, this film slowly started to actually come together. However, despite all of this, with all of the limitations they were facing, the Hoodwinked team knew that they could never really match up to the work that was being crafted by Pixar. Because, like I said, CGI technology was just a lot slower back in the day.
Our supervisors in the Philippines sat us down and said, we don't physically know how to render this whole movie within the next 6 years.
And so, to actually make this possible, they began to draw inspiration from things like stop motion and decided to settle on this very simplistic visual style. But even then, with this goal of simplicity, they still had to use basically every single trick in the book to get this to actually work. For example, Cory told me that for this big crowd scene here, they actually had to use little two-dimensional pictures that they projected into 3D space to cheat and to give it the illusion like they were fully three-dimensional characters, because there's no way they could have done it otherwise. But despite all of these efforts to optimize every little detail, this project was still so demanding that once the team committed to working on a shot, you know, like actually starting to animate and stuff, there was literally no opportunity to go back to the drawing board and start changing things like you so often hear films do these days, because they just didn't have the money to do so. Meaning that whilst they could tweak little bits of the shots here and there, the final film we're seeing here was basically the exact same film they had planned out on the storyboards years beforehand. And so the fact that every shot in this film still hits and feels good despite coming from such a rigid and also basically imagined place on a storyboard is just an absurdly underrated achievement of this film. And so considering all of the things that were working against the team, I honestly think that Hoodwinked looks pretty good for what it is. Because considering they started from literally nothing, the artists behind this film managed to achieve an absurd amount, as you've got multiple characters covered in fur, in big environments with avalanches and crowds and day to night lighting and rivers and much more. And as Cory mentioned frequently throughout our chat, so much of this film only came together through a mix of both absurd luck and very hard work. So even though Hoodwinked does look a little bit strange, I do genuinely think it's quite the commendable achievement. But we'll loop back around and wrap all of this up in just a minute, because first there was one other major aspect of this film that I wanted to touch on, and that was the influence of the Weinsteins. Because whilst word of this film was spreading around the creative world, in the real world, the general public had no awareness of it whatsoever. And so the Hoodwinked team had to find someone who could distribute this film for them, and therefore handle stuff like the advertising, getting it into the cinemas, making the DVDs, and just all of that stuff that you don't even think about when you're actually crafting the film. And so to get it distributed, the Hoodwinked team showed it to literally anyone who was remotely involved with animation, with the desperate hope that just someone would pick it up.
And we showed it to everybody. We showed it to DreamWorks. We showed it to Sony. But a lot of studios were just starting to get into the animation game. So none of them wanted to pick up this indie film. They were all developing their own stuff in-house. And I mean, I'll be honest, you know, the animation, even at the time, looked a little rough. It looked like this diamond in the rough indie film. But it started to get a lot of fans around town. And really the reaction we would usually get is, oh my gosh, man, I love your film. Great job. Good luck with that. So we showed it to everybody, and it was literally, we were shaking our heads like, I don't know what to do.
And so as production on the film was starting to wrap up, it was beginning to seem like all hope was lost, because without a distributor, then just no one was going to see this film. And so all of the team's blood, sweat and tears would have just been for nothing. Until at the last minute, one of the biggest villains in cinema history suddenly came along to save the day. And that was Harvey Weinstein and his brother. Because at this point in time, the Weinsteins had just sold their former company, Miramax, to Disney. And now they were setting up a new company, the Weinstein Company. And with this, they really wanted to get into animation just to beat Disney at their own game, which meant that when Hoodwinked came along, it was exactly what they were looking for. And so now it was at this point in our interview where I wanted to ask Cory if he had to do any favors to get in with the Weinsteins. But much like those who worked for Harvey, I was just too scared to ask. And so instead, I just let Cory explain it to me.
And so we get this phone call where they're like, the Weinsteins are getting into the animation game. They want to see your movie. And within 2 weeks, we had a deal on the table that we were signing.
And so with the Weinsteins involved, suddenly everything just started to happen. You know, posters, trailers, press tours, famous actors for the voices, and even bringing in George Lucas's Skywalker sound to do the sound mix. All of which must have just been absolutely incredible for the people who worked on this film. However, it also turns out that bringing in a bunch of big name Hollywood actors to do the voices on your little indie film at the 11th hour is actually a really, really difficult thing to deal with. Because at the time they were brought in, the film was basically completely animated and rendered, meaning it was essentially finished, and was essentially finished based off of the work of the previous voice cast, who were largely just friends and family of people like Cory and Todd. And so now these big name Hollywood actors had to match the work of somebody else, which according to Cory, they quite rightly hated.
I think a lot of the people that are used to being on camera, and also just rightly so, being actors who create their performance from scratch, it is a very frustrating process. And there are some people that can do it like that, and there's some people that, it is death. It creates a very wooden, very mechanical performance because they're just doing it over and over. We had to do it over and over until they got the lip sync right. And that is not how I want to work with actors.
Yeah, as a director, how are you sort of handling that? Are you having to keep your cool the entire time?
Yeah, I'm just like, oh, it's great. Let's try one more time. And we punch in like, let's do this one phrase again. And sometimes it was like my sound editor had to just like get me on the headset and go, look, it's good enough. I'll get into Pro Tools. I'll stretch this vowel, I'll shorten this pause. We can make it work. Because the actor's getting so frustrated, we're entering the point of diminishing return. But I will say, I'm so fortunate that like Patrick Warburton's performance as the wolf, he was there from the beginning. So his stops and starts, the way he does things was animated to that. It was so great.
And so, despite all of these issues, thanks to this massive marketing push right towards the end, this film ended up having a very successful release all across the world. And from its tiny budget of only $8 million, he managed to profit an absurd $110 million at the box office. But beyond just being purely profitable, I think the real story behind Hoodwinked's production is that with enough hard work, any limitation can be overcome, be that geographic, financial, technological, or even visual. Because that's the big thing, that whilst this film may not be the prettiest, it still manages to stand tall on its fantastic writing, story, songs, and characters. And because of that, and because of all of these efforts behind the scenes, it's managed to become an absolutely timeless classic. And so, if you are a fan of this film, there was one more final thing that Cory mentioned to me right at the end of our talk, and that was that, out there in movie-making land, there is actually a lot of interest in more Hoodwinked being made. And so, Cory said that if we want to see more from Hoodwinked, then the best way is to just start being as vocal as possible about it online, in order to make it clear that we want to see more from this world. And speaking of which, I'd just like to thank Cory so much for talking with me, and if you want to hear more about Hoodwinked, the full interview is up right now on my second channel, where he spills the beans on a lot of stuff that I just could not squeeze into this video. Like, just exactly what went wrong with Hoodwinked 2, what it's really like working with the Weinsteins, how he met Quentin Tarantino, and much, much more. And with that, we've reached the end of the video, so please be as loud as possible in the comments about Hoodwinked, and I'd also like to thank all of my Patreon subs as well, who help keep these videos as high quality as possible.